If you read the corners of the internet where corporate myths are born, where history is neatly packaged into bite-sized, shareable narratives, you might stumble across a particularly compelling headline. It goes something like this. For 50 years, a British pharmaceutical giant secretly solved Africa's malaria crisis, and the mainstream media said absolutely nothing. It is a fantastic story. It possesses all the narrative hooks of a modern legend. The silent corporate savior working in the shadows. The ultimate triumph of British scientific ingenuity. A conspiracy of silence from a media obsessed with bad news. There is just one fundamental problem with this narrative. It is wildly, unequivocally untrue. Nobody has solved malaria. Even today, despite decades of funding, a child dies from the disease almost every single minute. It remains one of the most ruthless and efficient killers in human history. But, like all enduring internet myths, this headline is a mutation of a much deeper, far more complicated, and infinitely more fascinating truth. The real story belongs to AstraZeneca, or, more accurately, it belongs to the ghosts of the companies that built it. It is a story that forces us to look straight at the uncomfortable, often brutal legacy of the British Empire. It demands that we understand the cold, unforgiving economics of modern drug development. And it centers on a single boardroom decision that defied nearly every established rule of pharmaceutical capitalism. They didn't cure malaria, far from it. But what they did do in the shadows when they finally realized the existing system of medical research was entirely broken, for the developing world might just have changed the blueprint for global medicine forever. To understand the AstraZeneca of today, we have to travel back to an era when corporate names weren't focus-grouped acronyms designed to sound vaguely futuristic. We need to look at ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries. It is a name that practically sweats gin, tonics, and colonial administration. Founded in the 1920s, ICI was a colossal enterprise, the chemical backbone of an empire that spanned the globe. In the 1940s, that very British Empire had a problem that guns, ships, and sheer willpower couldn't fix. It was losing the Second World War not just to the Axis powers, but to mosquitoes. For centuries, the only reliable treatment for malaria was quinine, an alkaloid harvested primarily from the bark of cinchona trees. It was bitter, it had severe side effects, but it kept you alive. However, when Japanese forces captured the Dutch East Indies, what is now modern-day Indonesia, they choked off roughly 90% of the world's quinine supply virtually overnight. The Allies were geographically rich, controlling vast swathes of Africa and Asia, but they were medically bankrupt. Without anti-malarials, troops fighting in the tropical theaters of Burma, Malaya, and the Pacific were experiencing casualty rates from disease that entirely dwarfed their combat injuries. Whole divisions were being decimated not by bullets, but by parasites. Enter IC. Tasked by a desperate British government to find a synthetic alternative to quinine, their researchers working in the damp, industrial laboratories of Manchester were essentially given a mandate. Find a chemical fix, or we lose the tropics, and quite possibly the war. It was an undertaking of staggering proportions. They were searching for a needle in a molecular haystack. In 1945, after synthesizing and testing literally thousands of chemical compounds, a team led by Dr. Dave Curd and Dr. Frank Rose finally struck gold. They discovered proguanil, which would soon be marketed to the world under the trade name Paludrine. Paludrine was a masterstroke of wartime science. It was significantly safer than earlier synthetic attempts and highly effective at suppressing the parasite. For the next half-century, it became a frontline defense across sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. It was issued to soldiers, colonial administrators, and local populations. It allowed massive post-war infrastructure projects to go ahead in malaria-endemic regions. Without hyperbole, it kept millions of people alive. If there is even a grain of truth in the myth that a British company solved malaria in Africa, it rests entirely on the broad, historical shoulders of Paludrine. But biology is a relentless, unforgiving adversary. Over the decades, the malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, did what it always does. It adapted. It mutated to survive. The parasite is incredibly complex, constantly shifting its genetic makeup to evade whatever chemical weapons we throw at it. By the late 20th century, resistance to older drugs like Paludrine and chloroquine was surging dramatically across Africa. The miracle drug, while historically monumental, was no longer the magic bullet. The death toll began to rise again, which brings us to the dawn of the 21st century. The landscape had entirely shifted. ICI had long since spun off its pharmaceutical wing into a company called Zeneca, which subsequently merged with a Swedish pharmaceutical giant to form AstraZeneca. The empire was gone. The modern, publicly traded megacorporation had arrived on the scene, and the macroeconomic reality of treating malaria had become a pharmaceutical nightmare. Welcome to the cold, hard arithmetic of Big Pharma. Developing a completely new drug today is a monumental undertaking. It takes well over a decade and costs upwards of £1 to £2 billion. It requires navigating a labyrinth of clinical trials, regulatory approvals, and frequent, devastating failures. Pharmaceutical companies are willing to take these massive, billion-pound risks because they know they can recoup the costs and generate immense profits by selling the successful drug to wealthy healthcare systems in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe. If you spend £1 billion developing a novel cancer therapy, you might make 10 billion back. This is capitalism functioning exactly as it was designed to. But what happens when the disease you are trying to cure almost exclusively affects people who live on less than £2 a day? Malaria is the ultimate market failure. It is profoundly and intrinsically a disease of poverty. The people who desperately need the cure are the exact same people who are least able to pay for it. For a massive, publicly traded company like AstraZeneca, whose shareholders and institutional investors demand consistent quarterly growth and high profit margins, investing billions into a new anti-malarial drug isn't just a bad business decision. In the ruthless eyes of the financial market, it is practically corporate malpractice. Yet, for a time, AstraZeneca valiantly tried to fight the math. In the early 2000s, they established and maintained a dedicated research facility in Bangalore, India, specifically targeting neglected tropical diseases like malaria and tuberculosis. It was a noble effort, perhaps a conscious nod to their deep historical legacy with Paludrine. They poured millions of pounds into employing top-tier scientists, hoping to find the next major breakthrough. But by 2014, the financial gravity simply became too heavy to defy. AstraZeneca announced the permanent closure of the Bangalore facility. The media backlash was swift and highly critical. Campaigners and journalists accused them of abandoning the developing world in order to chase highly lucrative, high-margin oncology drugs for Western markets. And looking purely at the headlines, it is incredibly easy to categorize this as another classic, cynical case of Big Pharma villainy. But behind closed doors, long after the outrage had subsided, AstraZeneca's executives and chief scientists were making a secondary decision. A decision that generated almost zero mainstream press coverage, but one that fundamentally disrupted how early-stage disease research is conducted. They realized that while they could no longer justify the billion-pound research and development cost to their shareholders, they were sitting on something perhaps even more valuable. They were sitting on a goldmine of half-finished research, abandoned chemical compounds, and decades of highly proprietary data. In the fiercely competitive pharmaceutical industry, intellectual property is oxygen. It is your lifeblood. You do not share your failures, you do not share your structural breakthroughs, and you certainly do not share your chemical library. It is guarded with the exact same paranoia and security as national defense secrets. But AstraZeneca did the unthinkable. They decided to give the keys to the vault away. Instead of locking their research in a corporate archive to gather dust and be forgotten, AstraZeneca formed an unprecedented, groundbreaking partnership with the Medicines for Malaria Venture, a non-profit organization based in Geneva, dedicated solely to reducing the burden of the disease. AstraZeneca opened up their highly prized, proprietary compound library, a massive digital and physical catalog containing hundreds of thousands of chemical structures. They essentially approached the non-profit researchers and said, "We cannot take this to the finish line. The market will not let us. But here is all our data. Here are our chemical compounds. Here is what worked. And more importantly, here is what failed. Have at it. Entirely for free." In academic circles, this is called open innovation. It sounds like a slick buzzword from a Silicon Valley tech startup. But in the notoriously secretive, cutthroat world of Big Pharma, it was practically a revolution. Suddenly, independent scientists across the globe, funded by charities, universities, and government grants, had unhindered access to highly guarded chemical starting points. If a university lab in London or a dedicated research institute in Cape Town found a compound in AstraZeneca's library that showed even a hint of promise against the malaria parasite, they could isolate it and develop it without facing a wall of corporate lawyers. We cannot point to a single, specific village in Africa today and definitively say AstraZeneca cured them. That is the very nature of open-source science. It strips away the corporate branding. It decentralizes the credit. But what we can measure, and what scientists have measured, is the sheer velocity of research. By sharing their library, AstraZeneca effectively shaved years off the early discovery phases for non-profit researchers. They provided the foundational chemical scaffolding that is currently being used across the globe to test the next generation of single-dose, highly resilient cures. According to reports and researchers from that era, this radically collaborative approach catalyzed a massive surge in neglected disease research. It broke the taboo of sharing. It forced other pharmaceutical giants to look in the mirror and reassess their own dormant archives. Soon after, companies like GSK and Novartis were also finding innovative ways to share data and collaborate with nonprofits, realizing collectively that diseases of extreme poverty require an entirely different economic playbook than diseases of affluence. Let's be brutally honest and strip away the romance. AstraZeneca is not a charity. They are a multi-billion-pound behemoth. They closed their dedicated tropical disease lab because it simply did not make financial sense, and they ruthlessly shifted their immense resources into highly profitable areas like cancer treatments and, famously, the COVID-19 vaccine, where they once again faced intensely complex questions about global access, patent waivers, and corporate profit. But history is rarely a simple, easily digestible tale of pure heroes and absolute villains. It is messy, it is driven by competing interests, and it is full of gray areas. The legacy of this British corporate lineage is undeniably twofold. In the days of empire, ICI's Paludrine held the line against malaria when the world was quite literally burning. It was a product of its specific time, a top-down, fiercely protected chemical triumph mandated by the desperate need for colonial survival. But perhaps their more enduring and far more important legacy in the ongoing fight against malaria is what they did when they finally stepped away from the microscope. By relinquishing total control, by openly admitting that a strictly capitalist structure could not solve a humanitarian crisis of this magnitude, they helped invent an entirely new way of doing science. They didn't solve Africa's malaria crisis in secret. No one has. But by unlocking their heavily guarded vaults and handing over the architectural blueprints to the world, they ensured that the scientists who finally do solve it won't have to start from scratch in the dark. And sometimes, knowing exactly when to give away your most valuable secrets is the most radical, world-changing innovation of all.